Olá, daqui fala o Ricardo Ribeiro. Se Portugal se fechou em si mesmo desde março, com fronteiras fortemente limitadas, operações policiais à saída de concelhos, proibição de ajuntamentos e constante estado de alerta, nada disso é novo para a população palestiniana. A faixa de Gaza sofre um bloqueio internacional imposto por Israel e o Egito desde 2007. Há mais de 2 décadas que quase 2 milhões de pessoas, das quais 2/3 são refugiadas e metade são menores, vivem dentro de um retângulo de 365 km², do qual não podem sair sem a autorização de um dos governos, onde apenas uma em cada 10 casas tem acesso à água potável e onde estão sujeitos a mais ou menos constantes massacres por parte da força colonizadora. O último genocídio foi exatamente há 2 anos, quando 195 pessoas foram assassinadas pelas Forças de Defesa de Israel, o IDF, incluindo 41 crianças, e ainda 29 mil ficaram feridas. Talvez o tampão a que Gaza é sujeita explique porque apenas existem até hoje 20 casos de pessoas atingidas pela Covid-19. Contudo, medidas restritivas impostas pelo governo israelita para controlar a transmissão do coronavírus podem resultar numa ainda maior restrição da ajuda humanitária, deixando a população numa posição ainda mais frágil. Em 2012, uma comitiva da Organização das Nações Unidas visitou a faixa de Gaza e publicou um relatório impressionante. Não havendo mudanças políticas drásticas, a região seria inabitável em 2020. Chegámos a esse ano. Se no resto da Palestina o movimento de pessoas era já muito restringido pelo IDF, com checkpoints a cada poucos quilómetros e um muro que lhes limita a entrada em Jerusalém e ao resto do território ocupado, tudo ficou pior a partir de março, quando começaram a ser introduzidas medidas de contenção do vírus por parte da autoridade palestiniana e Israel. O governo Netanyahu ordenou mais limitações na passagem de um lado para o outro do muro. Apenas trabalhadores essenciais poderiam atravessar o checkpoint na condição de permanecerem do lado de lá durante mais de um mês, sem voltar às suas casas. Não mais que 50 mil pessoas aceitaram as condições, o que resultou na perda de rendimentos para dezenas de milhares. Além disso, a pretexto da saúde pública, legisladores israelitas aprovaram há cerca de 2 meses um mecanismo de vigilância, apresentado como temporário, que permite às forças de segurança monitorizarem cidadãos que tenham sido contaminados pelo vírus e que com eles tenham privado. Tudo isto tem sido posto em prática por Netanyahu, um primeiro-ministro muito criticado, acusado de corrupção e que enfrenta julgamento nos tribunais israelitas a partir do final deste mês. Um primeiro-ministro que ficou aquém da maioria parlamentar que lhe desse poder para conseguir formar governo em 3 eleições consecutivas, num espaço de 1 ano. E que ainda assim decidiu assinar um acordo com o maior partido da oposição, que o indicará primeiro-ministro a partir de hoje, 15 de maio, durante 18 meses, para depois trocar a cadeira com o seu parceiro Benny Gantz para os segundos 18 meses. Um acordo que dá luz verde à anexação de colonatos ilegais e permite a expropriação e pilhagem de terras palestinianas, como desenhado no, entre aspas, plano de paz, anunciado em janeiro por Donald Trump e negociado entre os Estados Unidos e Israel. Por outras palavras, um plano de paz para a Palestina negociado sem os palestinianos. Amanhã passarão 72 anos desde a Nakba, ou catástrofe, em português. Data em que se assinala a destruição e limpeza étnica perpetradas pelas forças israelitas em 1948, altura em que metade da população palestiniana foi expulsa e 500 vilas foram destruídas para dar lugar ao Estado de Israel. 70 anos depois, não há paz à vista. E enquanto políticas de apartheid continuam a ser implementadas para condenar um povo à subjugação, haveremos sempre de ter outros problemas mais importantes a resolver. O Covid-19 é só mais um. É por tudo isto que a 5ª edição do Ask Me Anything Fumaça será sobre este tema. Como convidado teremos Ziad Youssef, membro do Comitê de Solidariedade com a Palestina e do Movimento Internacional de Boicote, Desinvestimento e Sanções, o BDS. Atualmente é assessor de imprensa no Parlamento Europeu para os eurodeputados da esquerda europeia. Será no dia 26 de maio, pelas 21 horas. Os Ask Me Anything são exclusivos para a comunidade de Fumaça. Se ainda não fazes parte, considera juntar-te a nós, apoiando o nosso trabalho em fumaça.pt/contribuir. Agora sim, fiquem com a entrevista que fizemos ao historiador israelita Ilan Pappé em maio de 2018. A entrevista é em inglês e podes ler a transcrição e tradução da conversa no nosso site. Até já. Bem-vindas e bem-vindos ao Apenas Fumaça, onde se fala sobre a sociedade com quem quer falar sobre ela, hoje desde o Isqueté, em Lisboa. Eu sou o Ricardo Ribeiro. Hoje temos como convidado Ilan Pappé, historiador israelita, professor no College of Social Sciences and International Studies na Universidade de Exeter, no Reino Unido, diretor do European Center for Palestinian Studies e do Exeter Center for Ethno-Political Studies da mesma universidade. É autor de variedíssimos livros como The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine e A History of Modern Palestine, One Land, Two Peoples. Esta conversa vai ser em inglês. Welcome to Apenas Fumaça.
It's a great pleasure to be on your program.
My dear Samir, I remember the house courtyard with a mulberry tree at its center, which pulled the houses together to form a home, my grandfather's home. We left everything as it was: the horse, sheep, bull, open doors, hot dinner, the adhan of supper time, and the lone radio. Perhaps it has stayed until now to broadcast the news of our victories. We went down into the valley to swerves and lead to the southeast, opening the wellspring in a meadow that led us to the village of Shab. This is where my mother's relatives live and where her family members were arriving from the village of Damun, which fell to the occupation. There, after a few days, the farmers from the nearby villages gathered, those who sold their wives gold to buy French-made rifles to liberate Al-Birwe. They liberated it early in the evening. They drank the occupiers' hot tea and slept the first night of victory. The next day, the quote-unquote Salvation Army took it over without interruption. Then the Jews reoccupied it and destroyed it to the last stone. And now we wait on the heights of the homeland. We wait for the return. This is a letter wrote by Mahmoud Darwish, Palestinian poet born in 1941 in Al-Birwe, from where he and his family had to leave to Lebanon on the 15th of May of 1948. What happened on that day?
Well, what happened on that day has to be put in a context of what happened 3 months before. You cannot just look at the 15th of May. Around the beginning of March 1948, that is about 2 months and a half before that date, the leadership of the Jewish community in Palestine decided to use the historical moment of the British decision to leave Palestine in order to create...
So the end of the British mandate.
The end of the British mandate, in order to create new realities on the ground. And what they wanted was to have, as a settler movement, they wanted to have as much of the land as possible with as few of the local native people as possible. And then they devised the plan that the moment, even before the British would leave, that they would start in March 1948 what I called in one of my books the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, namely a systematic expulsion, massive expulsion of the people of Palestine, including Mahmoud Darwish village, Birwe, and they decided to use the fact that the British they knew the British will not interfere, that the Palestinians had no military capacity to resist them, and that the Arab world would not interfere until May the 15th. So they used very well these 2.5 months before the 15th of May, which is the day the State of Israel was established and the all-Arab attempt to save the Palestinians began. They used very well these 2.5 months to destroy all the urban space in Palestine, namely destroy the Palestinian neighborhoods almost everywhere in Palestine, and to destroy hundreds of villages.
Well, more than 500 villages were destroyed, more than 800,000 people left and were expelled. You also write in your book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, a few of the methods that were employed to forcibly evict the people: large-scale intimidation, laying siege to and bombarding villages and population centers, setting fire to homes, properties and goods, expulsion, demolition, and finally planting mines in the rubble to prevent any of the expelled inhabitants from returning. Can you explain why you use the term ethnic cleansing?
Yeah. First of all, what you quoted is from the official Israeli plan, Plan D, we should say.
Plan Dalet.
Plan Dalet. It's not something that I wrote. This is something that the military commanders wrote in order to explain to the soldiers what they should do with villages, which is exactly what you described. Ethnic cleansing is now a very clear concept from the point of view of international law, from the point of view of historical research, And this is an act to purify a mixed ethnic space and to make it or transform it into a space that belongs to only one ethnic group. In other words, it's not the only place in the world, and it's not the only time in history where one ethnic groups decided to use, for whatever reasons, any means that is at its disposal to get rid of another ethnic group. And when this kind of ideology is at work, we call it ethnic cleansing. So that was the first reason I used it. The second reason is that I was amazed by the fact that the word cleansing, not ethnic cleansing, but the word cleansing is used again and again by the Israeli commanders and soldiers to describe what they do in Palestine in 1948. They openly say, we have cleansed the Galilee, we have cleansed this part of Palestine, we have cleansed the city of Jaffa, the city of Haifa. And they explain exactly what cleansing means, that is emptying it from its indigenous local population, de-Arabizing it, creating a Jewish space instead of an Arab space. And I think that together, the general definition of ethnic cleansing and the language used by the Israelis themselves when they started acting against the Palestinians convinced me that this was the right term.
Ethnic cleansing is considered a crime against humanity by international criminal court. Mm-hmm. Was Israel ever condemned by a crime against humanity?
No. One should say, first of all, that until the 1980s, most of the academic communities, let alone politicians and media, did not regard what happened in Palestine as ethnic cleansing. The only people who claimed that something like ethnic cleansing, although they didn't use the term until my book came, something like ethnic cleansing happened in Palestine. The only people who did it were the Palestinians themselves. But the rest of the world, treated this as a figment of Oriental imagination. They did not...
A conflict or a war.
A war, a conflict. They accepted the Israeli narrative that the Palestinians foolishly rejected the United Nations petition plan. They left voluntarily to make room for the Arab armies to enter.
They used the word transfer.
Yeah, the Zionist narrative talked about voluntary transfer, which is ridiculous. Nobody's transferred voluntarily. But that's how they presented it. So I think, first of all, we've just started to, both Palestinian historians and more open-minded Israeli historians, we only started to inform the world of the term in the last 10 or 15 years. So I'm not surprised that until today, nobody has even thought of making Israel accountable for what happened. But it will have to be accountable if we want peace. Peace will not come without a certain Israeli acknowledgement of its criminal policies in 1948. And also, I think what we realize more and more is that ethnic cleansing is going on today. The Palestinians call it in Arabic Nakba al-Mustamira, the ongoing Nakba. Because they rightly say that even after 1948, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine continues. Sometimes on a very low level, just the expulsion of one Palestinian, the destruction of one Palestinian home, or just one Palestinian village. But all in all, from 1948 until 2018, there isn't one day when some sort of ethnic cleansing is being not performed on the ground, and some sort of mechanism of bringing Israel to justice on this would be necessary.
Nakba that can be translated into catástrofe.
Nakba is the Palestinian term.
Nakba is the day of the 15th of May of 1940.
Commemorating when the Palestinians talk about the Nakba, they talk about the period that began in the beginning of 1947 and ended at the end of 49, kind of 2 years in which half of, as you mentioned before, half of Palestine's villages were destroyed, most of its cities were ruined, and half of the Palestinian populations were expelled. This is the Nakba. But nowadays, I think more people using the ongoing Nakba, naming that the catástrofe is continuing and has continued without any interruption since 1948.
And why do you think the narrative you tell and the story you tell and wrote about multiple times is not the official narrative today? Why do you think that happens?
Well, first of all, let me say that this narrative is now much more accepted, at least in some parts of the Western academia, than before. I think it's unfortunate that the mainstream media in the West does not accept it yet. The reasons vary. I think we have to differentiate between the places we talk about. I mean, there are different reasons why in America this narrative is not accepted, and there are different reasons why in Europe people don't accept it. In America, this has a lot to do with the Israeli lobby, the strength of the Christian Zionist community there, and the kind of strategic thinking of a lot of neocons in America. So you put all these three groups together, you understand there's a shield that does not allow this narrative to penetrate into the mainstream media discourse. In the West, in Europe, it's a bit different. I think the Holocaust still plays a very important role for many European journalists and politicians that kind of see Israel as the redemption of what Europe did to the Jews, and they don't want to touch it. I think lately this also has to do with Islamophobia because of the so-called war on terror. And I think that also plays a very important role in the case of the Europeans. And again, then when you go to Europe, you have to differentiate between different countries. Germany has its own problem with challenging Israel, understandably. Britain has its own problem.
Elias Khoury, Lebanese and Palestinian writer, wrote in his novel Gate of the Sun, memory is the process of organizing what to forget.
Yeah, amnesia. There is, of course, but I think there's more than this. It's not just memory as a place where you decide what to remember and decide what to forget. It's also the fact that certain connections you are not willing to make. For instance, nobody in Europe is willing to make the connection between anti-Semitism and Zionism. Namely, that both anti-Semitism.
Explain what Zionism means.
Yeah, Zionism means the Jewish national movement ideology that believes that Palestine is the ancient homeland, where the Jewish people should have independence and self-determination. And the movement of Zionism is the movement of allegedly bringing back the Jews to the ancient homeland and rebuilding a Jewish homeland that was there according to this narrative in the times of the Bible. Zion is one of the names the Bible has for Jerusalem. That's where Zionism comes from. Now, this contradicts, of course, the idea that Jews may have the right to be normal citizens in any other country in the world, as other Christians do, or Muslims, or anyone with or without a religious affiliation. And the problem was that in Europe, Jews were not allowed to be assimilated, were not given full rights. In fact, in some cases, as we know, were threatened with elimination, as indeed happened, unfortunately, during the Second World War. Now, this whole ideology that the Jews do not belong to Europe is also subscribed to by the Zionists. They say, yes, Jews do not belong to Europe, they belong to Palestine. And therefore, this is the kind of problem for the Europeans. Their failure to grant Jews an equal place in their society, especially given the history of the Jews in Europe, who really contributed immensely to European culture and civilization. In fact, one cannot think about Europe without the Jewish contribution to it. The very idea that the Jews should not be part of Europe, and then the Zionists come and say, okay, if you don't want them in Europe, let's put them in Palestine, and that's how Europe supports the colonization of Palestine, is the kind of thing. So it's not just about memory, it's about making the right connections, even if they're unpleasant. That I think what is missing.
Jamal Juma, coordinator of the Stop the Wall, a campaign that aims to tear down the wall constructed in 2010 by the Israeli government, told us this in September last year.
But we will not accept to live as slaves in our land. And that's what they want us to do. They want us to clean their roads and to clean their garbage. And that's not going to happen. We are not going to be another Native Americans. simply, it is this simple. If they want us another Native Americans, we will not be.
Is this story similar to the indigenous people and the indigenous populations in America?
In many ways it is, because both the Zionist movement and the settlers who created the modern state of the United States were part of a phenomenon we call settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is different from classical colonialism. This is when people are forced to leave Europe and they want to create a new homeland. And usually they find places where other people already live. And then what they do is they try to get rid of the local people in order to create a new identity. So in this respect, there is a similarity between the way the white settlers treated the Native Americans and the Zionist settlers treated the Palestinians. There is a difference, of course, of the level of success of the project. The settler colonial project in North America was quite successful, unfortunately, because the Native Americans were genocided. Although, as you know, they're still Native Americans and they're still struggling, and they still believe that they have some chance of at least some sort of restitution, if not, of course, bringing back the clock backwards is impossible. Now, I think Jamal Juma is absolutely right that the case in Palestine in this respect is very different. The settler colonial Zionist project is not absolutely successful. Half of the people living in Palestine are still Palestinians. The Palestinian refugees live nearby. The Palestinian liberation movement is still active and is still trying to change the reality. They have a lot of problems. They're disunited, they're fragmented. I also believe that it will not succeed. The problem is that until this happens, a lot of people would die and suffer. So the big question for me as an activist is there a shortcut? How can we convince the Israelis to do what the whites in South Africa were willing to do, which is to give up their apartheid settler colonial state?
In 1917, a public statement issued by the British government read, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. This declaration is known as the Balfour Declaration. What is the relevancy of this declaration on this whole issue?
Right. Yes, 100 years ago, the British promised something that did not belong to them and gave it to someone it didn't belong to. The importance of this declaration is in the fact that it provided the basis for a later international legitimacy for the colonization of Palestine and the dispossession of the Palestinians. I think that's what is so important. The declaration itself was not very important. Britain gave such promises to everyone in the Middle East. They gave such promises to the Kurds, to the Armenians. Most of them they didn't keep. And they would not have kept this promise had it not served their purposes after the First World War to have a Jewish, what they thought would be a Jewish colony under the British Empire. They didn't mean to give the Jews real independence. But what it mattered is that because Britain became the mandatory power, and the mandatory power gave the issue of Palestine to the United Nations, it began this internationalization of the question of Palestine in a way that created an imbalance in Palestine. The Palestinians, who were a normal people living on the land, suddenly had to explain to the world why do they reject to solve the Jewish problem in the world in their own homeland. And they had very little to say about it. I mean, they said, well, because this is our homeland, why should we pay the price for what you did to the Jews in Europe? And Britain created with the Balfour Declaration this equation, saying that any problem that the Jews have in Europe would be solved in Palestine at the expense of the Palestinians. And until today, the Palestinians find it very difficult to succeed in front of such a powerful alliance of the United States, the EU, the United Nations, and other groups that do not even question the right of the Jews to have a racist state at the expense of the Palestinians.
Even if the Palestinians made up 2/3 of the population, The United Nations partition plan, who divided the territory in 1947, gave more land to the Jews, around 56%, and less to the Palestinians, 44%. What was the role of the United Nations, who were created just 2 years before, in this whole thing of Nakba?
Yeah, I think what the main crime of the United Nations was that from the very beginning, the people who were involved in the organization understood that partitioning a homeland is a project that the national liberation movement cannot accept. For example, they would have never suggested to the Algerians to partition Algeria between the French settlers and the local Algerians. They knew that there were, I think the United Nations was fully aware that what they propose is not a peace solution, but is an legitimization for the creation of a Jewish state with the hope that some compensation for the Palestinians would make it work. I think they already knew 2 days after the partition resolution was accepted that this was not a recipe for peace, but just a recipe for a disaster. And I think that the United Nations carries a very important responsibility for knowing exactly what goes on and doing nothing about it. It had enough representatives on the ground to understand what the role they played in producing the catastrophe, the Nakba.
So coming now to today, Netanyahu and his Likud party won the parliamentary elections in 2015, 3 years ago, with 23% of the votes, then forming a coalition with 4 other parties or alliances. Does this mean that a majority of the population supports the continued and ongoing occupation of Palestine?
Yes, I think it does. I think it's fair to say that the majority of the electorate, of the Jewish electorate in Israel, sees actually the so-called conflict with the Palestinians as solved. They don't think there is a conflict anymore. They think Israel obtained its objections in the West Bank. The West Bank is quiet. They don't know what's going on in the West Bank. There's a wall that separates them from anything that happens there.
Only constructed in 2002.
2003, yes, began in 2001, finished 2003. They did not. The media, their media, does not tell them what's going on there. They see Gaza as a problem, but not as a problem of occupation. They say we left Gaza, and there's a group of Islamic terrorists there. But this is not just our problem; it's the problem of the world. So yes, for all intents and purposes, the Israeli Jewish electorate thinks that any Palestinians' further demand is terrorism. They fully support the Israeli action in the Gaza Strip. They have no moral problems with arresting children in the West Bank or destroying the city of Gaza from the air.
Well, even in the last month, during the Great Return March, where thousands of Palestinians went to the border between Gaza and Israel, more than 40 people were killed, more than 7,000 people were injured, including Yasser Murtaja, assassinated by a sniper from the Israeli army, a Palestinian journalist with the word press on his body. Comment what's happening in Gaza and why that leads into what you were saying, that the Palestinian people still support what's happening there.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mentioned before the term al-Nakba al-Mustamira, the ongoing Nakba, or the ongoing catastrophe. And the events in Gaza show you exactly how the two, how the past and the present are actually at the same time. Because there are two demands, actually, of the protesters in Gaza. One is to end the Israeli siege, and the other one is to allow the Israelis, the Palestinian refugees, the right of return. For the Palestinians, it makes sense to demand both things at the same time, because they're part of the same catastrophe. Not being able to go back to your home and living under the siege is the part of the same suffering, and it's caused by the same reason, the Israeli ideology. And I think the demonstration, by the way, they were not organized by the Hamas. They were organized by the young people of Gaza, but the Hamas cleverly decided not to object to them, but just help them with this. They are going to continue beyond 15th of May, and they're going to spill over to the West Bank, and I suspect also into Israel itself, into the Palestinian community who are citizens of
Do you think
Israel.
an intifada is coming?
I think we're already in kind of a third intifada. It's like a historian, I can tell you that we always try to understand an event according to the parameters of the previous event. So we're trying to figure out a third intifada on the basis of what we know of the first and the second. It will not look like the first, and it will not look like the second. It would have its own features, and I think we are having these features now. Maybe it's a longer process than the previous intifadas. Maybe it has long periods of inactivity. But when a historian would look back at the years 2017 to 2027, maybe they will talk about the decade of a third intifada. It's very clear that Israel has put the Palestinians in a position with the back to the wall. They have nothing to lose. And people who have nothing to lose are likely to protest and to resist. What would be the form of the resistance? We see the beginning of indications for that. We know the horrific Israeli response to that, so we don't know exactly how it will develop.
For decades, and especially after the Oslo Accords in 1993, a set of agreements signed by Israeli government and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the status quo is that the Palestinians and the Israelis should get to an agreement of a two-state solution where the territory is split into two states. Do you agree with that?
No, I think that's, it's like looking for a key where there is light but not where you lost it. I don't think the problem is territorial. I don't think the problem is where would be the border between Israel and Palestine. I don't think the problem is the kind of dividing sovereignties or functions of government. I really don't think this is the heart of the matter. So I don't think the Oslo Accord offered anything apart from the symbolic important recognition of the PLO by Israel. I think that was important. But the rest was just, as I said, looking for the key where there was light and not where it was lost. Because settling the issue of the part of the occupation in the West Bank, or even unilaterally withdrawing from Gaza, is just small bits of the problem, which is called the Palestine question. If you pretend that solving small bits is solving the whole picture, you create a lot of disappointment and a lot of despair.
Well, we've interviewed in September last year Daniel Seidman, an Israeli attorney, a founder of the Terrestrial Jerusalem, and who participated in the Oslo Accords. He told us, is it a one-state solution?
There's no, the one-state solution doesn't exist. One-state solution is like saying Israelis and Palestinians hate each other too much to get divorced, so they're going to have a happy marriage instead. Bullshit. You can destroy the two-state solution. Netanyahu is doing that very successfully. Destroying it does not create an alternative.
I'll give you an example why this is a stupid remark by Mr. Steinman. Let's say that the Israelis agree to a two-state solution, and they are willing to evict the settlers, because otherwise you won't have a two-state solution, right?
The settlers that are now in the
Jewish
West
settlers
Bank.
that arrived in the West Bank after 1967. Where will they put these settlers? They will put them in the midst of the Palestinian community that lives in Israel. So the Palestinians would have to ask themselves the question of solidarity. I can get the settlers out of my life, but then they will make the life of another Palestinian community miserable. And this is why the two-state solution is not going to work, because the Palestinians don't live in one place. They're all over Palestine. And Palestine is not just in the West Bank, it's all over Israel. And if you try to divide it by claiming that by that you create an Israel and in Palestine, you're just eluding yourself. You need a comprehensive solution, and the only comprehensive solution is a one democratic state. The two-state solution is like treating your fingernail when you have cancer.
Thank you so much, Ilan Pappé, historian, author of The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Este foi mais um episódio do É Apenas Fumaça, onde se fala sobre a sociedade com quem quer falar sobre ela. O É Apenas Fumaça é produzido por Bernardo Afonso, Frederico Raposo, Maria Almeida, Pedro Duzarte, Pedro Cardoso, Pedro Santos, Tomás Pereira e por mim, Ricardo Ribeiro. A música é dos Lotus Fever. Hoje são mais episódios em apenasfumaca.pt ou no iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, SAP24, Comunidade de Cultura e Arte, RUM, Rádio Universitária do Minho e também noutras aplicações de podcasts. Até já!